On the 4th of November 1967, here in West Sussex, Flight 062 from Malaga in Spain en route to Heathrow in London was passing over this very hillside. Or at least it was supposed to be. What actually occurred was a horrifying air disaster, which transformed this peaceful wooded hillside around me here into a nightmarish scene. We're going to find out what happened, why it might have happened, and hear some of the harrowing accounts from those who were first on the scene. And I have to forewarn you that some of those accounts are not for the faint of heart, and are from people who suffered serious PTSD in the wake of this disaster, but I think are important to still include to show the brutal reality of dealing with the aftermath of a tragedy like this. This is the Blackdown air disaster. PC William Cooper, otherwise known as Bill, was the local PC at Hascombe from 1964 to 1972, and he alone was responsible for quite a large rural area, which he covered on the lightweight police motorcycle he'd been issued to perform his duties. On Saturday the 4th of November 1967, Bill was off duty and spending the evening relaxing at home. Now, the other police working in the area had been kept busy because there were fireworks going off all through the night, and of course they needed to be on hand just in case anybody accidentally injured themselves, or, you know, the kind of things you could expect to go wrong on bonfire night. Not long after 10 PM, his phone started to ring. When he answered, it was the control room at police headquarters, and what they told him is that a very loud bang had been reported south of Haslemere. Now, because everybody else was very busy, there were no other units available, and so they asked whether Bill could hop on his motorcycle to go and see what was going on. Now, you can imagine, as Bill left home on his motorcycle, he was probably thinking that this was just some huge firework that somebody had got a little overexcited about. So he may have been a little frustrated that his night had been interrupted by what was probably just going to be a routine call. As he made his way to the top of Blackdown Hill near Fernhurst, the weather was cold with a little mist hanging in the air. Not unusual weather conditions to find yourself in at this time of the year in the south of England. As he worked his way towards the top of Blackdown Hill, he noticed the faint glow of what looked like fire off in the distance. And so, parking up his motorcycle, he hopped off and started heading in the direction of what he could see. And it was about this point that the battery in his torch ran out, leaving him in almost complete darkness. Now, he had no radio on him, so he wasn't able to call for backup in the dark up on this hill. So all he could do was head towards where he thought the bang had come from. So he found himself in a field and started trudging in the direction of the glow. As he did, his leg came into contact with something on the ground and he tripped over. He couldn't immediately see what it was that had tripped him up, but when he started feeling around underneath him, he realized it was a sheep. And this sheep was very, very dead. Now, he was, of course, a little unnerved by this, but now definitely knew that there was something weird going on this hill. So he decided to keep going. And at this point, he stumbled into something else. And when he backed up to see what it was that he'd walked into, he realized it was a huge wheel. This situation was just getting stranger and stranger. About the same time, he started picking up on a very, very strong smell in the area, which he described as smelling very strongly like something like paraffin. Now, of course, all of these things coming together, the sheep, the tyre, the strong chemical smell, Bill was definitely starting to think that there was something very, very strange going on, and whatever it was probably going to require more backup, and that he, by himself, would probably not be able to deal with it alone. So, for a moment, he paused underneath a tree, desperately kind of trying to work out where he'd left his motorcycle. Obviously, he was a little turned around after what he'd witnessed in this field. And it was as he was standing underneath this tree that he realized something was dripping on him. Now, he immediately didn't think too much of this. It being a bit of a soggy night, you can understand just immediately assuming that it was just rainwater dripping out of the tree. But as Bill's attention was turned upwards into the trees above him, And in the surrounding area, he realized the horrifying truth. What was dripping on him was not rainwater. It was, in fact, bodily fluids from the victims of the horrifying plane crash that had happened right where he was standing. There were bodies in the trees. Now, I already saw on the drive down here how out of the way this is. There's a fairly long single track road that takes you down here. And so that is the position those first responders would have been in that night, traveling this remote country road at 10 o'clock at night in the pitch dark, and essentially just heading out to where they can see fire, fully expecting that they are probably not going to like what they find when they get there. And when you think of the first man on the scene, PC William Cooper, who had no functioning torch, was just on his motorcycle, but by the time he made it out here, he could see the fires and everything burning through this field, and so he headed out there to see if he could make heads or tails of what had happened. And then essentially found himself out here alone, stumbling through the dark and bumping into things that you would not want to bump into in your worst nightmares. The peace and quiet here right now is palpable. It's so difficult to imagine this calm and quiet just like it would have been that night, because, you know, it's bonfire night weekend, it's a Saturday, but it's 2 minutes past 10. Most of the fireworks are probably finished, so people are no longer expecting all that noise. So it's little wonder that when this peace and quiet was completely obliterated by this huge roaring explosion that people describe hearing, that most people's first thought was not a plane's just crashed into Blackdown Hill. In fact, I was just talking to a local chap who I bumped into here, who works on one of these estates, and he was saying that apparently a lot of locals' first assumption was that an explosion on Blackdown Hill, maybe it happened in the rumoured World War II tunnels they believed to be in this hillside. But of course what they found was far more devastating than that. Flight 062 was a Sud Aviation Caravelle SE-210, a modern short-haul passenger jet built in the 1960s. In fact, I believe it was built around 18 months before this incident took place. On board were 37 people, 7 Spanish crew and 30 passengers. Amongst the crew, the captain, Hernando Mara Pierres, was just 37 years old, but he was highly experienced. Even at such a young age, he had over 12,000 flying hours, including more than 1,500 hours in command of this particular type of plane. And he'd actually flown this particular flight to London over 100 times. On top of that, his training was all up to date, and his medical checks were full and complete. There was nothing particularly out of the ordinary. Next to him in the cockpit was his first officer, Jose Moreno Humada, age 40. Who had more than 11,000 flying hours, much of that time having been spent operating radios and the navigational equipment on board, of course with many years before a lot of that kind of stuff became more automated. The flight engineer was Jose Maria Alvarez Menendez, who was 55 and had over 14,000 hours in the air, on top of nearly 2 decades of airline experience. And then behind them, they had their 4 cabin crew, stewardesses and stewards who'd prepared the craft for what should have been a routine arrival into London. Everybody was properly licensed, everybody was medically fit, and nobody had shown any sign of fatigue beyond what should normally be expected from a scheduled evening flight. The 30 passengers on board were travelling from southern Spain to Britain, and were a mixture of holidaymakers, people travelling for business, and people returning home. Also on board was British film and TV actress June Thorburn, who was 5 months pregnant at the time, Coventry City Football Club Vice President John Clarkson, and Donald Campbell of the Campbell Aircraft Company. Of those 30 passengers, the majority were British, with some Spanish, Americans, and Australians on board as well. Flight 062 departed from Malaga at 7:40 p.m. and climbed smoothly to its cruising altitude at around 30,000 feet. And for about an hour and 40 minutes, the aircraft cruised north without incident. At 9:42 p.m, while passing over Alderney, the crew made contact with London Airways, reporting that they were at flight level 310, or about 31,000 feet, which was completely normal procedure when you're beginning a descent into London. From this point, air traffic control cleared the aircraft to descend in stages. First to FL 210, or 21,000 feet, then to FL 110, or 11,000 feet. Once the aircraft had cleared through those two altitudes, it reached FL 60, or 6,000 feet above sea level. Each time the aircraft descended through one of these altitudes, it was clearly transmitted to air traffic control, it was correctly acknowledged, and properly read back by the crew on board. Everything was very routine, and the cockpit voice analysis from the recording that was recovered shows no confusion, no language difficulty, no urgency, no stress at all. Everything seemed very normal. At 9:53 p.m, the aircraft reported descending through FL 145, or about 14,500 feet, which confirmed that the crew must have been well aware that they were descending below 15,000 feet. At this point, it was only a few minutes away from its arrival time at Heathrow, where it was due to arrive at 10 past 10, and air traffic control directed the aircraft to descend to FL 60, at which altitude it was supposed to level off on approach to Heathrow. The last instruction from London to the aircraft came at 9:56.
Direct to Epsom now if you wish. Magnetic track 050. Your own navigation.
The reply came instantly.
Roger. Direct to Epsom. Heading 050.
At this point, radar showed the aircraft turning smoothly onto its new heading. Nothing out of the ordinary. What those in air traffic control did not realise was that as that final transmission was made, the aircraft had already passed through FL 60, or 6,000 feet, its cleared altitude, and it didn't level off. Instead, from that point, it continued to descend at a steady rate of around 2,200 feet per minute. During this descent, it's almost certain, and this was pretty much confirmed in the report as well, that they must have had autopilot engaged, as was quite routine while those on the flight deck did various things in preparation for landing. There's a fair amount to do when landing, and so usually autopilot's pretty useful when it comes to taking care of the plane while you get everything else checked off. Just 1 minute and 47 seconds after the plane descended through 6,000 feet, its altitude had dropped to about 1,000 feet above sea level. At about 9:58 p.m, as the aircraft dropped to around 596 feet, it struck the tops of tall trees on the southern slope of Blackdown Hill. It continued to cut through trees for over 100 meters as parts of the aircraft, including the wings, were torn away. It destroyed a garage and narrowly missed a nearby house, although it did cause some quite serious damage. And then around 400 meters after the initial impact with those trees, it then finally came to a stop as it embedded itself in the hillside just beyond that house. Though it seems incredibly peaceful and idyllic now, this beautiful view would have been completely strewn with debris, let's face it, body parts, those sheep that were found. This would have been nightmarish. And standing where I'm standing now, you would have been either almost certainly caught up in this crash or borne witness to this plane coming right past where I'm standing. So the plane came through here, by this point pretty much touching ground the entire way, and ultimately the fuselage in two pieces ended up buried across the road just down there from where I'm standing, just next to Upper Blackdown House. And it really becomes apparent just how lucky the couple living in Blackdown House were that all that happened to their house was a bit of damage to the roof and they lost that garage. They themselves were obviously fine, apart from the trauma of what had just happened on their doorstep. Of course, the same could not be said for the 37 on board that flight. There were many other accounts from first responders to the scene, and they all describe similar horrifying aspects of the scene. Pretty much all of the accounts talk about noticing small bonfires all over the area, and a few which actually appear to be moving around. And these were, as PC Bill Cooper also found out, the burning bodies of sheep, many of which were dead, but some of which were still running around on fire before succumbing to their burns. PC Steve Gilbert and his colleague Doug Brazier were also some of the first on the scene. The nose of the aircraft was still intact and had buried itself into soft earth. I clambered inside, calling out, but it was dead silent. I saw the bodies of the flight crew still strapped in their seats. The main fuselage aft of the flight deck was completely broken up, and there were naked body parts, shoes, clothing, all over the place. Some body parts were impaled on trees, a sight I will never forget. PC Gilbert and his colleague tried to work their way through the crash site, trying to find anybody they could help, anything they could do, but by the time the fire brigade and the ambulances arrived, it became clear that there was no one to save. Powerful lighting was erected so they could see the entire scene, and a large canvas sheet was laid out so the remains of the passengers could be collected together. PC Gilbert explained that it was explained to him that the reason all they could find were unclothed body parts was the sheer speed of the impact had literally stripped the clothing from their bodies. Interestingly as well, PC Gilbert talks about how there was no time off, no counselling for any obvious shock suffered in the wake of this horrible event, and he explained how it just wasn't heard of in those days. Although he did say that his wife saw how much he'd been affected by it and found him some hospital brandy, which is something, I suppose. So where I'm standing right here on Ferndon Lane, just across from Upper Blackdown House, is where the fuselage finally came to rest, essentially burying itself into the hillside behind me. Upper Blackdown House is just there, so just here to the left of Upper Blackdown House is where the plane came sweeping through. So this entire area behind me here would have been completely smashed to pieces. Of course, it's not really human nature when you're approaching something that is completely outside of the norm, or, you know, in everyday life, to be walking somewhere and to look up. Mostly, we're pretty much focused straight ahead of us, but we're not very used to just standing somewhere and going, what's directly above me? And so put yourself in the shoes of one of those police officers or the emergency services. Of course, the first thing they're going to look at is the destroyed wreckage of this plane in front of them. And then they've got the distraction of the fires, and it's little wonder that with all that distraction going on, the last thing you're going to do is look up at a tree. But of course, the sheer explosive devastation of a plane crash like this means that debris is not just spread out across, a flat 2D plane, it is also thrown up in the air. And so what a lot of those first responders weren't expecting, and what they were soon to discover, was what was waiting for them in the trees.
Among the passengers killed was the actress June Thorburn. Apparently she was pregnant at the time, and the body of her baby was found in the trees. They had put a young PC on patrol out of training school, just 2 weeks. We walked around the scene with him, and he pointed out many features he had seen on his patrol. We came to an oak tree, and he stopped. He said we were looking at the remains of the actress June Thorburn. The area was completely destroyed, and It was obvious there were no survivors to be found alive. In fact, all we found was pieces of body lying all over the ground and in the trees. I remember staying there the whole night, and the following morning I remember a vast number of air cadets and such like attending, and were told to assist in collecting the pieces of body that were in the area. The cadets were only in their early teens, and were distraught, to say the least. They were not able to conceal their feelings, and indeed, stomach contents. Just as daylight was breaking, this was the first time I had actually got to the scene, and it was a very grim sight, with limbs and luggage hanging from every conceivable tree branch. The heavy smell of kerosene, burnt sheep, smoke, debris and metal everywhere.
All 7 flight crew and all 30 passengers were killed. The investigation pretty quickly concluded that this accident was not survivable. And in fact, it states that during the examination of the wreckage, only one fastened seatbelt was found, indicating that not one of the passengers had even begun to get ready for landing. Not that, in this case, a seatbelt would have made much difference. After the emergency services had arrived, villagers from nearby Fernhurst also helped to provide essential support. The village hall was turned into a temporary mortuary, and the Women's Royal Voluntary Service helped provide food and drink for the emergency services attending. All in all, the wreckage trail stretched for more than 400 metres, through trees, across farmland, and around Upper Blackdown House. Of course, we know from those first-hand accounts that one of the first things that many of the people arriving on the scene noticed were those dead and burning sheep. But apart from those sheep, there were no other fires in the area, at least nothing large, and it seems that as the aircraft was being smashed and torn to pieces through those trees, the fuel released from the ruptured fuel tanks must have exploded in the air in something of a flash fire, and it is that those poor sheep probably got caught up in. Of course, the damage to the parts of the plane was extensive, which didn't necessarily make the investigation completely straightforward, but what they did find is that both engines had been rotating under the full expected power at that point in their flight, and were still rotating under that same power at the point of impact, meaning that when they hit the ground, they were likely travelling at somewhere between 250 and 290 knots, or between 287 and 333 miles per hour. From what they could gather from what remained of the plane, there was no evidence of any pre-crash failures or any components that weren't functioning as they were supposed to be. All navigation aids were working properly. The altimeters, or altimeters, not sure, any pilots out there, feel free to correct me on that one, were extensively tested, though severely damaged. These were how the pilots would have known their altitude, but from the tests that were carried out, no sign of pre-impact malfunction could be proven at all, and they seem to have been working correctly. But we will come back to these, because these could be key. It was determined that the autopilot must have been on at the time of the accident, but at this point the autopilot would not have had any responsibility for maintaining altitude, and that is something that the crew would still have had to monitor. And post-mortem examinations of the crew didn't seem to reveal any evidence of incapacitation that may have caused the accident. So we had no technical faults, no environmental faults, and nothing that would seem to indicate a severe incapacitation of the crew. All of which led to a bizarre and confusing conclusion. That being that the aircraft had simply descended smoothly, steadily and normally straight through its assigned altitude and down into the ground. Nothing dramatic, nothing breaking up mid-air, it had simply casually descended to its doom. And the closest thing to a proper conclusion that the investigators could come to was that the most likely cause was that the crew were distracted during a high workload phase of the flight, that, being coming into land at Heathrow. And that because they were distracted, they just simply didn't notice that they were still descending. The report concludes simply but coldly, "The accident was due to the aircraft having continued to descend through its assigned flight level down to the ground. No reason could be established for the continued descent." The thing that immediately stands out, apart from how remote it is out here, is how hilly it actually is. When doing the research, you look at the area, or this area, on Google Maps or wherever, and you think, it doesn't look that hilly. Still don't quite understand how this could have happened here. It's not exactly, Mount Kilimanjaro, but it is very hilly around here. And if you're flying at 6 to 16,000 feet, these hills aren't going to really mean anything to you. But when you're flying potentially thousands of feet lower than that, it suddenly becomes a big problem. To take us back to PC Bill Cooper, who was, of course, first on the scene, his story is a particularly sad one. Bill's story is a classic case of undiagnosed or unrecognised at the time PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And this understandably dreadful experience that he'd gone through had a huge negative impact on him. The smell of aviation fuel gave him flashbacks to that night, meaning he couldn't fly. And he was later involved in an accident in a police van, which it seemed led to a nervous breakdown, leaving Bill off sick for a period while he recovered. It seems during this whole time, nobody associated the struggles he was going through with what he experienced in the aftermath of the air crash. And after an early retirement, Bill and his wife moved to Spain, where he ultimately passed away in 2007. Your thoughts really do have to go out to someone like PC Bill Cooper, who was just, the local constable. Pretty rural area to cover, just him and his motorbike. Not a lot going on for the most part, and then all of a sudden, one of the worst things you could possibly imagine bursts onto your doorstep. And to be really, the responsible party, the one who has authority and responsibility to go and see what's happened. And for that to mean he had to be the first person here. And to think of him stumbling his way in the dark through this field behind me, bumping into the corpses of the sheep that had been killed, the wreckage that was strewn all the way back there. And then obviously coming across what he found here. Really, nobody should have to see those kinds of things, especially not alone and in the situation he found himself in. What is, I think, hopefully a sign that he had started to try and come to terms with what had happened in his own way, is that speaking to the chap I've met here, is he was actually here, and he explained to me he remembers a young chap pulling up in his car, similar to me rocking up today, with his granddad, and the young chap getting out and asking him, hey, this is who my granddad is, this is the role he had to play, this is the part he had to play in this awful thing that happened here. He just wants to come and be here and just stand where it happened and see if he can bring some kind of finality to what he experienced. And apparently Bill got out of the car. It wasn't necessarily in the best way, as you can perfectly understand, and was walked down to Upper Blackdown House and reached a point where he just couldn't go on. And this is obviously 40 years after it happened, and it had clearly been living with him every day of those 40 years. So I do hope that being able to come here with his grandson helped him in some way before he passed. But the sad reality is it is probably nearly impossible to ever fully recover from witnessing something like this. So, what actually happened? How were the crew so distracted that they didn't notice how low they were? All of the radio communications indicate no level of stress at all. Everything seemed perfectly normal right up to the moments before the accident, so there didn't seem to be any obvious distraction. Well, the one thing the investigation did point out that could potentially have had some role to play was going to be cruelly simple. The altimeters installed on this aircraft had been known to be a little hard to read. The investigation produced several different images of the same type of altimeter, comparing how the dial would have looked at various different altitudes, in an effort to explain just how easy it could have been to misread this display. Here, it shows the altimeter at 16,000 feet, or FL 160, and here, it shows the altimeter reading at 6,000 feet. Now, this clearly demonstrates that there's not a lot of difference in the placement of the small hand on the clock, shall we say. It's roughly the difference of a centimetre between the hand positions. But that centimetre denotes a difference in altitude of 10,000 feet. Then, if we bring it down to 1,600 feet and 600 feet, again, the difference in the position of the hands is similarly slight. Now, if you were on that flight deck, busy with various tasks, preparing for landing, and you were to only every now and then glance over at the altimeter, I don't think it would be too ridiculous to suggest that it might be pretty easy to misread either of these altitudes. Now, the cross-hatching that you can see at the lower half of the dial is supposed to appear as altitude is lost, as another indicator of low altitude, but even this, I would contest, is not as clear as it could be. Then add to this the fact that during a descent, those hands would be in constant motion. So rather than just staring at a static reading like we can see here, those hands would be spinning, making it even more tricky, especially when distracted, to take an accurate reading. And of course, it doesn't take a genius to realise that misreading this altimeter and thinking you are 1 or 10,000 feet higher than you actually are could be pretty dangerous, and would, I think, go a long way to explaining why a plane might descend through 6,000 feet and keep going if they thought they were at 16,000 feet. Now, the only thing that puts a slight hole in this is the fact that they had confirmed back to air traffic control that they were descending through 14,500 feet, which would mean that they should have certainly known how high they were. But with a lack of any other good explanation, this is as close as we can get. Maybe they had confirmed at 14,500, but anyone can have a momentary lapse in concentration. And you might also be asking, well, surely they could see how low they were. Should have been pretty obvious, right, that they were about to fly into a hill. But remember, this is 10 o'clock at night, it's foggy in patches, visibility was supposed to be okay, but it's still pitch black outside, and this is the final section of their flight before descending into Heathrow, which just happened to be over miles and miles of fields and woodland. So as far as lights on the ground or landmarks that they could see to work out where they were or how high they were, there was nothing. At this point in the flight, everything outside those windows would have been pitch black. So again, as far as positioning and altitude, they would have been entirely relying on their instruments, which just leads us back to our misreading of the altimeter theory. And interestingly, the investigation does mention 3 other scenarios in which other aircraft found themselves in almost exactly the same situation. One in August 1965, when a B-727 descending at night descended through its assigned altitude of 6,000 feet again, before eventually crashing into the ground at 577 feet. Again, the last radio message was another routine exchange of information. The investigation into that was unable to determine the reason why. The second was October 1966, when a DC-9, descending again at night from a cruising altitude of 14,000 feet to its assigned altitude of 9,000 feet, which was again acknowledged by the crew, again appeared to have continued to descend until it eventually crashed into a mountainside at 3,830 feet. Interestingly with that, it was also clear that the autopilot had been on at the time, and that at the time the aircraft had sent its final communication, it was already 1,500 feet below that 9,000 feet assigned altitude. Again, the investigation could not determine the cause of the aircraft's descent into the mountain. The third case, fortunately, did not result in an accident. Another aircraft descending over water at night from 33,000 feet down to its assigned altitude of 6,000 feet, again passed through that assigned altitude. All three crew members in this case had been preoccupied with other duties. The first officer was at the controls, was occupied in retuning the VOR receiver. The commander was conducting radio communications using weather radar to locate other traffic, and the flight engineer was working at the engineer's panel, and only became aware that something was wrong when he realised there was no pressurization. From what they could see, it seemed that the aircraft was nearing an apparent altitude of 10,000 feet, and the commander had suggested reducing speed to 250 knots. But as the first officer eased the nose up to reduce the speed, all three crew members realised at the same time that they were actually almost at sea level, and in this case they were able to pull up and correct the situation and land safely. Now, of course, we still won't ever really be able to say for sure what happened here, but for me this would probably appear to be a combination of different unfortunate things, all coming together at the same time. Everyone on the flight deck was probably so occupied with their duties when it came to bringing the plane into Heathrow that they either didn't notice at all or had looked at the altimeters and again misread them, as it was very easy to do, and hadn't realised that mistake until it was too late. And not being able to gauge their position visually, all they had to rely on were those meters. Unfortunately, we will never know for sure. All we can say is that hopefully, because we do know that everything seemed very calm on the flight deck and there was no evidence that they tried to pull up at the last second, hopefully those on board didn't even have time to realise what was happening before it was too late. Now, like every air crash, every accident in most industries, aviation or not, this accident helped spur on the introduction of new various altitude alert systems, whether that be clearer visual indicators or even audio alerts in the cockpit. It also helped to improve crew resource management to make sure that crew were less distracted from certain vital things they needed to monitor during a descent like this.
You now find me about 20 miles north of Blackdown Hill. I am in Brookwood Cemetery, which is, I'm going to say, unlike many cemeteries I've been to. It's quite interesting. I mean, I am currently walking along a wooden platform, a wooden walkway that runs through, I assume, what at different times of the year is more of a pond slash small lake and less of a kind of a swamp. Also with the railway line running right past it here. It is also massive. There are two sides to it. There's a south and a north Brookwood Cemetery. I drove into the wrong one straight away, obviously, and then had to come over here. You know, I'm a bit of a dab hand at this now. I've been doing it long enough. I'm pretty confident in my ability to walk around a large cemetery and find a small plot somewhere. What is interesting or concerning, or however you want to look at it, on the map of this cemetery, there are also two other air disasters listed as being memorialised along with what is known here as the Fernhurst disaster. So I am expecting to see not just one plot, but three. Well, I've made it. As expected, there are two other plots here. One for a crash that happened in Spain, and another here that I can't quite make out. It is in fact the plot for the 1963 Perpignan air crash. And then finally here we have the memorial to Fernhurst, as it's called here, air accident. Now, of course, not everybody who died in this accident is buried here. Here, I believe we have 19 graves, mostly of the British victims of this disaster. Although I did actually read that there is one Spanish member of the crew buried here alongside the other victims. And of course, the families of some others chose to have them buried elsewhere, whether that be in family plots elsewhere or somewhere else. But 19 are here. And as we can see here, they are represented by the 19 headstones, these grey headstones that surround the central memorial. The memorial has seen better days, we'll say that much. There seems to be a little bit of subsidence around here, which is unfortunate. It means some of the headstones have actually sunken down a little bit into the ground. Interestingly, and this isn't something that I've actually kind of looked into, so I don't know, but one of the graves here, a Paula Clarkson, she's listed as being born in Blackdown. So I don't know if that's the Blackdown where this crash took place, but if it is, there's something about things coming full circle there, I don't know. It actually looks like it's much more likely that that was Blackdown near Leamington Spa, near Coventry, as Paula Clarkson was the 4-year-old daughter of John Clarkson, who we mentioned earlier, as being the vice president of Coventry Football Club. The thing that always strikes me with stories, disasters like this, is that every single one of these people boarded a plane in Malaga, expecting, you know, what should ultimately have been a very straightforward trip home. And instead of home, that plane brought them here. And of course, 60 years ago, it's not even one generation ago, so I'm sure there are many out there who these were either friends, family members, people who still remembered these victims fondly. And if you're one of those people, then feel free to share whatever you want about that person in the comments below. It would be lovely to hear stories about these people as they were in life, rather than me standing here and just talking about them in death. And something that I almost forgot to mention is that almost exactly 24 hours after this plane crash took place was the Hither Green train crash, the last disaster I covered on this channel. All in all, it made for a particularly depressing bonfire night weekend. Well, from here in Brookwood Cemetery, I hope you found the video interesting. I know these aren't always easy to enjoy, that's definitely not the right word, but I hope you found something of value in this. And if you did, like, subscribe, that all really helps the channel out and helps you to see more videos like this from me. And again, if you have any memories of this, or if you are in any way related to those involved, then if you want to, feel free to share that in the comments below. I really enjoy, again, there's that word, I find it very touching and nice to see people sharing their memories in the comments. So, well, on that note, I'll see you in the next one.